Welcome to Ghetto Coding. Today I'm going to be showing you how to implement a 3-tier architecture into a .NET Core application, specifically a .NET Core web application. So let's get going then. Firstly, you'll need to open Visual Studio. I'm using Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition. From there, you'll need to select Create a New Project and select the ASP.NET Core Web Application template and select the Next button. Right, next we're going to have to give our project a name. I'm going to call mine core_3tier. And let me just select the application quickly. Great. Right, we're ready to now select the Create button. Right, let's make sure the web application template is selected, and I am using ASP.NET Core 2.2. Right, and it's great. Let's select the Create button, and our project should now be created for us. Alrighty then, let's go ahead. So our project's created, so let's go ahead and add 2 new projects. We are going to be adding class library projects for both, but .NET Core, so let's go ahead and do that. There we go, class library. And we're going to create our data access layer here. So let's just call it DAL. Alright, let's wait for that. Cool, that's done. So we don't need this auto-generated class. We can just delete that. Let's now add the next layer to our project, being the logic layer. And it's also a class library of .NET Core, type .NET Core. And let's just call it logic, because that makes sense. Alright, so there are our 2 layers, and we'll now go ahead and configure the data access layer. Yeah, let's remove that class as well. Great. Alright, let's start with the data access layer. So now that we're ready to go, let's start with the data access layer. Before we actually start, we need to add 2 NuGet packages. The first being the configuration.json package, which you will need to do through the NuGet package manager. As you can see now, I will now add that package. So let's just search for it. Alright, there it is. You'll select it and then select install. You'll then need to select OK. Another tab, or should I say window, will appear. There it is. Let's select accept. Great. So that's installed. The next package that we need to add is the entity framework core.SQL server package. Alright, so let's go ahead and search for that. Great, there it is there. You'll need to select it and select install again. Great, select OK. Let's wait for the next window to appear. Looks like we're going to have to wait for this one. Alright, there we go. I accept, and I think we're done. Yeah, and it's installed. Great. And there they are. Now you can see the 2 packages we've added. Right, so the next step is we essentially need to get the connection string from the presentation layer, being our web layer. So let's firstly add that connection string. I'm just going to copy and paste it, so I don't have to type it out again. But there you have it, and if you want to pause, you can just copy that out. Obviously, you'll need to provide your database name and your credentials, along with the server that you're connecting to, the SQL server you're connecting to. So there it is. So now we want to be able to connect to the database. So we're going to add a helper class now that allows us to obtain that connection string from the web project, or in this case, our presentation layer. As you can see, I've also added a folder called DataContext to the data access layer. This is where we will be adding our first helper class, which will obtain the connection string for us from the app settings.json file. Alright, so let's go ahead and add that helper class so we can get this connection string here. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add a class. Let's call it app configuration. I guess it is grabbing the app settings.json file. Alright, before we can start, we just need to add some references here. first being system.io, the next being the Microsoft extensions.configuration, because we're going to be using a configuration builder. Before we can start, let's make this public. Let's also add the string that will essentially be allocated the connection string from the app settings.json file once we've obtained it. So let's call that SQL connection. Actually, let's call it SQL connection string. Let's now add a constructor so that every time we initiate an instance of app configuration, we get everything we need. So let's go ahead and specify a config builder. I'm using vars, it's just easier to read when doing a tutorial for you guys. So a configuration builder, if you don't know, is just used to obtain configuration settings. It essentially just builds an object which obtains and holds onto key values, or should I say keys and values, from a config file, in this case our app settings.json file. To obtain the file, we obviously need to specify to the configuration builder as to where that file is. So I'm currently just creating a path string here that will do exactly that. So as you can see, I'm getting the current directory of the project and then obtaining the app settings.json file. That get current directory will essentially get the current directory of the startup project being the presentation layer. And our presentation layer is our web layer being core_3t. Let's now add that JSON file to the config builder. Now we can go ahead and get the actual connection string from the app settings.json file and allocate it to our SQL connection string variable. I've actually missed a step here. I can't get the file section yet, as I need to actually initiate the config builder or tell the config builder to get the file and basically obtain the values. So to do that, you'll say configuration.build. This will now go ahead and load the JSON file into the config builder. Now that we've got the actual JSON file loaded into the config builder, we can now get the section we're looking for, that being the connection strings, and the subsection of that being the default connection string, in this case the default connection. So now let's tell the config builder that's what we want. And there we have it. Now that we've got that, we can now allocate the connection string to the SQL connection string variable. And to do that, you'll just say app settings.value, and there we go. And the app configuration class is done. Now that we finished with our app configuration class, let's now add the database context class. This is essentially just going to allow us to interact with our database along with the tables, entities, etc. So let's go ahead and add that class. Great, the class is added. Let's also add our references to, or our reference to entity core. Go, entity framework core. We're going to be having to inherit from DBContext. This is basically the main class. It's a built-in class that allows for interactions with our database. So I'm going to be creating a class here within our database context called options build. This is going to allow us to initiate our database connection along with its entities. So the first item we'll be adding, or variable within the options build class, is the DBContext options builder. Basically, this is an API which allows us to configure the connection to our database. Right, the next item or variable we're going to be adding here is the DBContext options. Basically what this allows us to do is obtain and hold on to database configuration information. Anything like database provider, what database provider must be used, etc. Now obviously we can't initiate any of these connections without getting the connection string itself. So let's initiate a app configuration variable here. This is the class we just recently created that obtains our connection string from the app settings.json file. We want the options build class to be accessible from anywhere within the data access layer. So I'm going to initiate a new instance, but a static instance of it. And then once we've done that, I will add a constructor to then initiate and obtain the app configuration, so that once that's initiated, we can get the connection strings, etc. What is it complaining about? I've got an extra T in, I think. Yeah, there we go. So this constructor is just going to initiate all its variables and items within it. So the ops builder there, we're telling it to use SQL Server, and we are now passing it the connection string. Now let's create a constructor for our database context class, for the entire class. Below the constructor is where we will add our dbset references to our entities. As our DBContext does not sit in our startup project, we need to tell Entity Framework which database context to use. So to do that, we need to create a class which implements the Design-time DBContextFactory interface. So I'm going to create that class now. What that class is going to allow us to do is to handle database migrations and database updates from the data access layer. So let's go ahead and create that class. We're going to create it in the same folder as where we have our database context and app configuration class, that being the data context folder. So we're just going to call it DatabaseContextFactory. Right, now this class has to essentially inherit a couple of things, but before we do that, let's just add the references we require. So as you can see, the two references that we're going to need is the Microsoft Entity Framework Core.design package along with the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. So let's now continue with what needs to be done here. So now we're just going to add a reference to the our-design time DBConteXtFactory interface. So let's just declare the app configuration class here again so we can grab the connection string we need. Now just remember, this is going to be the class file that the entity framework looks at when it's looking for the database connection to use when it creates our tables according to our entities within our data access layer. So I've already explained to you what some of these items already are, so I'm not going to go ahead and explain them again. As you can see, now you understand why that app configuration class is so helpful. We can grab that connection string whenever we need it. So we have to return the database context to the entity framework, otherwise it's not going to know what to use when it has to basically initiate our database and the entities. Obviously the entities I'm talking about are our tables. Alright, so now that we've finished with the DBContextFactory class, let's now go ahead and add some entities so we can add a data migration and initiate a database. So let's go ahead and create a folder called entities. Here we will just be adding our actual classes that represent our entities within the database. So let's create a class entity called user. Alright, let's add that. Great. Let's make this public. Alright, we need to add data annotations here so we can allocate our primary keys or should I say primary key and what fields are required, etc. We'll have to add data annotation schema later when we add foreign keys, but let's just keep things simple here and create a simple user class here. So we're just creating our primary key here. Let's just call it ID. Allocate our getter and setter. And we're just going to add a username and password, which are both required. So let's add the username of type string, and let's also add after that, let's do password. We're just keeping this rather simple, as this is just purely for examples to show that our data access layer and logic layer, once we connect it all up and expose it to the presentation layer, that everything's working. And we might as well add one more field here. So I've included password and email, and yeah, that's it. Alright, so this is a representation of our user entity. And now we are going to initiate our DB set and reference the user entity we've just created, so that when we do our data migration and database update, that our user table gets created. Alright, so there we go. Our table is going to be called users, and it represents the user entity that we've just created. Alright, so now let's go ahead, just double check your database connection there and make sure everything's working. And let's jump into the data migration and database update. Before we do that though, let's actually do this before we forget. I want to just reference the database access layer to our logic layer and then expose our logic layer to our presentation layer being the web application. So let's just add those references so those are done so we don't have any issues later. Alright, that's done. Now we can start with our database migration. So we have to reference the database access layer here, as that's where our database context information sits. So first we're going to create the migration. So you go add dash migration and then the name of the migration. Let's just call it initial DB create. That's fine. This is our initial database creation. And press enter. So now it's going to create the necessary migration files for that to be done. So as you can see, there they are. They're all the migration files. And now let's initiate this data migration by updating the database and executing those files. And to do that, we are simply going to add the following into the package manager console. Update-database. This now will go create our database and our necessary tables within our database server. Alright, so now that's been done. Great, and that's done, no issues there. So let's go look in our database and see if our database is there. There it is there, MVC underscore core DB. Cool, let's see if our user table and all of that is there. And whoop, there it is. There we go. There is our users table, representing our user entity right there. Right, so let's make this a bit more complicated. Let's add another entity here. So, let's just add something. So let's add an authentication entity here. That way we can throw in some foreign keys and just expand on what we have here. So let's add that authentication entity. So let's create that class. Let's call it authentication level. Great, so that's been created. So let's make this public. I'm just going to copy and paste this class. Otherwise, we're going to be here all day. Alright, so we've got an auth ID and a auth name. And we just got to put a reference there to the data annotations package so we can allocate our keys and required fields. That's been done. Let's add a foreign key. So let's reference the authentication level table from the user entity. So let's say every user is allocated an authentication level. So they need to reference that authentication level by the authentication level ID. So let's add the auth level ref ID. There we go. Right, and this is our foreign key. Let's now just let the authentication level entity know that there is a key that is referencing it. Right, and there we go. So we allocate the type of foreign key and then allocate the name of the actual column, which is auth level ref ID, and it references the users table. Or should I say it sits in the users table. Right, so there we go, we've got another entity there. Now that we have our new entity, let's now add the entity to the DB set and initiate a new data migration. Alright, so let's add that DB set referencing our new entity, and we'll just call it authentication levels. And there we go. Now we can begin a new migration. So let's initiate that migration, add migration, and give it a name. And once that's done and the migration files are created, there we go, they have been created, we can now update the database with our new entity and changes to the user entity. Alright, that's done. Let's see now in our database if those changes have been made to our tables. And there is our authentication levels table, and let's see if users is referencing it. There we go. There's our foreign key referencing the auth ID within the authentication levels table. And there are two migrations, the original migration and the migration we just initiated now.